All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going way back and looking at the long history of mission strategy.
Yeah, mission strategy, that is those deliberate, intentional ways that people have spread their, well, their religious beliefs.
That's right, and we're really covering a huge sweep of history here. I mean, we're going back
Yeah,
centuries,
yeah,
right?
definitely. We're going to be looking at stuff way before, like the Protestant world missions that people usually think of first.
Exactly.
So we're going to be tracing those strategies, like how they developed over time, and kind of, touch on the Protestant era as well.
That's right. You know, what I found really fascinating in just getting ready for this deep dive is how these efforts across like different times and different cultures, they actually show us these like fundamental things about people, about, what motivates us,
Yeah,
about how hard it is to share ideas across cultures,
yeah.
and even like just the challenges of getting anyone to change their worldview.
It's really tricky.
It is. So to unpack all of this, let's go way back to the 8th century
Okay.
to a guy named Boniface.
Yeah, so Boniface, he's like one of the earliest and clearest examples of a mission strategy.
Okay.
Like a deliberate one,
Yeah. Yeah.
He was working with the Germanic pagans.
Okay.
And he had a really comprehensive approach. Like, first off, he knew, like, communication was key.
Right.
So he preached in a language that was actually pretty similar to theirs.
That makes sense. I mean, that's just communication 101, right?
Exactly.
Got to be understood. But it sounds like he didn't stop at just language, right?
No, no.
I mean, the notes mention some pretty direct tactics, I guess you could say.
Yeah, direct. I mean, he really got in there. He challenged their beliefs, like, straight up.
Okay.
Famously destroyed their shrines, and he even he cut down the sacred tree.
Yeah.
And super symbolic move. What did he do? He built a church right on that spot.
Talk about making a statement. But it wasn't just about, dismantling what they already believed, was it?
Right. Like there's a more constructive side too, right?
Totally. He got that conversion. It wasn't just about changing your beliefs. It was about a whole way of life.
Okay.
So he focused on education, on, what he thought of as making society more civilized. And to do that, he set up these monasteries, which were not only centers of learning, but they taught practical stuff too, like agriculture, raising animals, domestic skills.
Right.
It was all about building a stable society around the church.
So it was really holistic, like mind, body, spirit kind of thing. And I see that women, they actually had an important role in his strategy.
Yeah, super interesting, right? He actually brought over nuns, specifically from England, to run these programs for women, teaching domestic stuff, education. It's a really early example of women being formally involved in mission work.
That's really interesting.
And then to make it even more effective, he made sure to recruit locals, convert them, and then make them into priests and monks.
Right.
Building up leadership from within the community. That makes a lot of sense, empowering the people who were already there. And this wasn't a solo mission, right? He had backup from the church back in England.
Oh, for sure. He would constantly send back reports and ask for advice, and they'd send him people and money and supplies, and most importantly, prayers.
Yeah.
Real partnership.
A true sending mission. Unfortunately, though, it sounds like this, this effective model, it didn't last. What happened?
Well, a couple things. First off, all those invasions that hit England, they really messed up that support system.
Right.
Back on the continent, things were getting complicated too. Missions were getting tied up with imperial ambitions.
Okay.
All these leaders, the Frankish kings, their German successors, even the Byzantine emperor, the Pope, they all started seeing missions as a tool, a way to expand their power.
So the main goal shifted from genuine conversion to grabbing land and power.
Exactly. And that had consequences. The Scandinavian kings, for example, they actually preferred to use English missionaries because they didn't want to get tangled up in all that continental politics.
It's interesting how even choosing which missionaries to use was a political decision.
Yeah, totally.
Now the next part of this, it gets into the Crusades, but it sounds like they're generally not considered to be a legitimate form of mission strategy.
No, not really. The Crusades, they were all about military conquest, European Christians trying to take land from Muslims.
Right.
It didn't really have anything to do with genuine persuasion or sharing faith.
Oh, yeah.
And honestly, they really hurt Muslim-Christian relations, created this legacy of hostility and suspicion that still exists today.
So using force, in this case, it was counterproductive.
Yeah, definitely.
But even during, all that conflict, there were people trying different approaches. Like Francis of Assisi really stands out.
Oh yeah, Francis, right in the middle of all that violence, he's like, nope, there's got to be another way.
Right.
So he travels to Egypt, meets with the Sultan himself with a message of love and peace,
Wow.
trying to persuade through kindness, not warfare. And he inspired a whole movement of missionaries who followed that same principle of peaceful engagement.
Totally different spirit. And then there's Ramon Lowell. He's called the Fool of Love.
Yeah, Fool of Love, interesting title, right?
Yeah.
So Ramon, he was this, wealthy, well-educated guy, but he gave it all up, dedicated his life to trying to convert Muslims. But his way was different. He believed in reason, using your brain, having these intellectual debates.
Okay.
He even developed this system. He called it the Ars Magna. It was like his attempt to create this universal logic system, a way to prove that Christianity was true through pure reason.
It's almost like a philosophy toolkit for evangelism.
Exactly, yeah. And he wasn't just sitting in his study thinking about this stuff. He was constantly traveling, talking to popes and kings, trying to get them to set up these colleges where they would teach Arabic and train missionaries in these, in this debate style of sharing their faith.
That's dedication. So we've seen a bunch of different early approaches, from Boniface's pretty in-your-face style to Francis's emphasis on, peace and love, to Lowell's more intellectual route. Now, fast forward a few centuries to the age of huge colonial expansion.
Right, like the 16th to 18th century.
Yeah, it seems like a mission. It took on a whole new look during that time.
Yeah, it did. That's when Christianity got really wrapped up with the goals of those big European powers,
Yeah.
Portugal, Spain, France, they were all expanding their empires, and mission became a part of that.
So the line between spreading faith and empire building got pretty blurry. Super blurry. When the Pope divided up the non-Christian world between Portugal and Spain, he basically made them responsible for converting everyone in their territories.
Wow.
So mission was now official government policy.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. First, the Portuguese.
Okay, so the Portuguese, they built this massive trading empire, right?
Right.
But except for Brazil, they mostly just controlled small areas directly. Their thing was suppressing local religions, kicking out any ruling classes who resisted, and then they'd foster these Christian communities, but mostly made up of their own mixed race descendants or converts from the lower classes.
So it's a top-down kind of strategy?
Yeah, pretty much.
What about the Spanish? It seems like they had different goals, at least at first.
Yeah, the Spanish, they aimed for a full transplant. They wanted to take Spanish Christianity, Spanish civilization, and just plop it down in the New World.
Okay.
But, and this is a big but, that ambition came with a really high price. The indigenous people, they got exploited, brutally.
The Carolingians, for example, they almost completely disappeared.
That's terrible.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about, neglect. There was active cruelty.
Right.
And that's actually what led some missionaries, like Bartolomé de las Casas, to become these, fierce defenders of the indigenous people's rights.
So even within all this, colonialism, there were people pushing back against the abuses.
Definitely.
The notes mentioned something called the mission system that the Spanish developed. What was that all about?
So the mission system, it was really central to their strategy, especially in those frontier areas.
Okay.
They'd set up a central mission station, and a town would grow up around it as they resettled indigenous people. Usually there was a small military presence for protection.
Right.
Smaller satellite missions would be set up nearby too.
Okay.
And within these mission towns, indigenous folks would learn Christian practices. They'd be involved in the services, as acolytes and singers, and some even served as civil officers. They also, they adapted the local festivals, brought in Christian themes, they taught agriculture, the whole deal.
It sounds like they were trying to, weave indigenous people into this new, social and religious framework.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The idea, at least on paper, was to preserve them, civilize them, and Christianize them.
Okay.
Which, it's different from that later forced displacement that we see in some other places. But there's a twist, right? There's this thing called secularization that happened later, and it really messed things up.
Okay, so what does secularization mean in this case?
So once the government decided that the indigenous folks were civilized and Christian enough, they'd secularize the missions.
Okay.
They'd replace those dedicated missionaries with diocesan clergy who were often way less committed and less qualified.
Right.
And then they'd put in secular government officials. And without the missionaries there, those lands that were supposed to be held for the indigenous communities, they often got handed over to Spanish settlers.
Oh, wow.
And the indigenous folks, they ended up as, landless laborers. It was a direct result of those political interests taking over.
Yeah, we saw earlier how that started to happen, and this secularization, it's like the long-term consequence of that shift.
Yeah, totally.
It's a bummer. It's a really disappointing outcome. It shows how tricky it is when, religious and political agendas get all mixed up.
For sure.
Now let's jump over to the French, but specifically in Canada, they had a pretty different approach, right?
Yeah, super different.
Shaped by their own colonial priorities.
Exactly. The French in Canada, they weren't really focused on building a huge settler colony. They were more into trading, fur and other forest resources.
Okay.
So they didn't want to mess with the indigenous way of life too much.
Right.
And the missionaries had to adapt their strategies because of that.
So we don't see those giant resettlement programs or that forced cultural integration like with the Spanish.
No, not at all. French missionaries, they often lived right in the indigenous villages, adapting to their lifestyle. They focused on preaching and teaching and baptizing, but they generally let converts keep a lot of their traditions and culture.
Okay.
Some towns did spring up near the French settlements, with churches and stuff, but most indigenous converts, they didn't live there permanently.
So a much more integrated and less disruptive approach.
Yeah.
Now the French were also pretty active in Indochina, which is, Vietnam today. And the notes talk about a pretty radical strategy there. Why was that?
Indochina was a whole different ballgame. The French missionaries, they faced a ton of persecution, constantly being kicked out.
Wow.
So they had to come up with something new.
Okay.
And a Jesuit named Alexander de Rhodes, he came up with this really sophisticated system for training native lay evangelists.
Okay.
These guys, they lived under a kind of religious discipline, and they could operate under the radar. And it worked. Yeah, even with all the persecution,
Yeah.
they had tons of conversions. It was like that saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Necessity is the mother of invention, exactly.
Yeah.
And this success, it actually had a ripple effect on future missions, right?
Huge ripple effect.
Yeah.
This model directly led to the founding of the Foreign Mission Society of Paris.
Okay.
And their big thing was training a native diocesan clergy. They knew that in the long run, those local leaders would be the best at evangelizing their own people and taking care of the churches. And, that focus on training locals early on, it really paid off.
Again, we're seeing that emphasis on local leadership pop up over and over. Now, the 17th century, it saw the rise of these, what are called modern mission theorists.
Right.
Who were these guys and what did they bring to the table?
So the 17th century, it wasn't just about, doing missions. It was also about thinking about them, strategically.
Okay.
So we have these guys like Jose de Costa, Brancati, Thomas Achesu. They're considered the first modern mission theorists. They wrote these manuals, these handbooks, basically,
Okay.
laying out all these principles and practices, what makes a good missionary, how to engage with different cultures.
So there's a real shift towards a more scholarly, thought out approach to missions.
Yeah, for sure.
And around this time, there was also a big organizational change in Rome, right?
Yeah, huge. In 1622, they set up this organization called the Sacred Congregation for the propagation of the faith.
Okay.
It was based in Rome. And their job was to coordinate all Catholic missions around the world.
Okay.
They also started setting up missionary training centers, professionalizing the whole thing.
Right.
Trying to standardize how missions were done.
So centralized planning and training, that's a pretty big step in the evolution of mission strategy.
Totally.
Now, the notes also talk about the Jesuits being really innovative at this time, especially with their what they call indigenization approach.
Yeah, indigenization.
Yeah.
That was all about adapting to the local culture, taking cues from local customs and traditions.
Okay.
And the Jesuits, they were bold, man. They pushed the boundaries, sometimes even ignored those Portuguese restrictions to get into the East. And their first big experiment with this was in Japan.
Okay, so what did they change in Japan? How did they adapt?
Well, Japan, they really tried to blend in. They adopted Japanese-style homes, wore Japanese clothes, followed the local etiquette.
Right.
But they drew a line at, adopting Shinto or Buddhist stuff. They wouldn't use those terms or concepts when they were, teaching Christianity or setting up churches. It was this balance, right?
Yeah.
Be culturally appropriate, but don't compromise your theology.
Okay, so it's cultural accommodation, but with limits. And they also really went all in on using the Japanese language, right?
Big time. They produced tons of Christian literature in Japanese, printed on their own printing press,
Right.
run by Japanese converts. Local Japanese deacons and teachers, they played a huge role, and they even ordained some Japanese priests. So they were building a church that was deeply rooted in the local culture.
Again, we see local language, local leadership, super important. And it sounds like this is a pattern, the success. It was cut short by a pretty serious backlash, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's a tragic story. When the shogun, who was basically the military dictator,
Right.
he got worried about all these foreigners and their influence. So in the 17th century, he closed off Japan to the outside world and started persecuting Christians.
Wow.
Thousands were killed. Christianity went underground, survived in secret for like 200 years.
It's amazing that it survived at all.
It is. It shows how resilient faith can be.
It does. The notes then talk about another Jesuit experiment in Madurai in South India, led by a guy named Robert de Nobili.
Nobly, yeah.
And his approach seems even more radical when it comes to, like, immersing himself in the culture.
Yeah, so de Nobili was convinced that to really reach people in India, he needed to get to the Brahmins,
Okay.
the top of the caste system.
Right.
So he basically became a Christian Brahmin. He dressed like a Hindu guru, lived like one. He followed all the caste rules, learned Sanskrit.
Wow.
And he studied Hindu philosophy really deeply, presented Christianity using those concepts whenever he could. And, he's one of the few missionaries who actually had success converting Brahmins.
That's incredible, the lengths he went to. That's like a really deep level of a cultural adaptation.
It was. I mean, it really blurred the lines in some ways.
And then maybe the most famous example of this cultural accommodation is in China with Matteo Ricci.
Yeah, Ricci. His strategy was revolutionary, and, it's been debated ever since.
Okay.
So, like the Jesuits in Japan, they adapted to the local ways of life, embraced Chinese culture.
Right.
But they took it further. They started introducing Christian ideas by, finding parallels in Confucian thought.
Yeah.
And they even let converts keep doing those ancestral and state rites. They argued that those were more like social and civic duties, not really religious.
Wow, I bet that was super controversial, letting people seemingly participate in other religions.
Oh, yeah, super controversial. It caused a lot of trouble within the Catholic Church.
I can imagine.
But Ricci and his crew, they gained a lot of influence.
Okay.
They were respected as mathematicians, astronomers, cartographers, all that. They brought Western knowledge to China, made connections with important people, even served in the imperial court.
Wow.
And their whole goal was to open doors for the gospel. And it worked, at least for a while. They built up a pretty large Christian community with some really influential members.
That's kind of like a Trojan horse strategy, using cultural exchange and knowledge to make way for their religious goal.
Exactly. But of course, this accommodation, it didn't sit well with everyone.
No surprise there.
Other missionaries, they were really attached to their European traditions.
Right.
And they saw what the Jesuits were doing as, dangerous, maybe even heretical.
Okay.
So they started attacking them, formally accused them to the authorities in Rome. And there was a lot of, nationalistic rivalry going on, too.
Right.
It wasn't just about religion.
So how did that whole conflict play out?
Well, unfortunately, Rome ended up siding with the Jesuits' opponents.
Okay.
They issued these decrees condemning their practices, banned them, and from then on, any missionary going to the East, they had to swear an oath that they wouldn't do this stuff.
Wow.
Chinese Christians, they were forbidden from doing those family and state rites. And now Rome explicitly said those rites, they were religious.
So that was a pretty big blow to the Christian community in China.
Huge blow.
Oh.
Now suddenly to be Christian, it meant rejecting, essential parts of your Chinese identity.
Mm.
And Christianity started to be seen as a threat, especially to that core Confucian idea of filial piety, respect for your ancestors.
A major setback for Christianity in China. But the notes say that, in the long run, the idea of accommodation, it eventually gained more acceptance.
It's amazing, actually. A couple of centuries later, that oath was abolished, and modified versions of those rites were allowed.
Wow.
So the Jesuits, they may have lost the battle, but their idea that cultural accommodation, that, the gospel could be expressed in different cultural forms, that idea eventually won out.
That's a great example of how important it is to understand and adapt to different cultures, even if it takes a long time and causes some serious conflicts along the way.
Yeah, totally.
Now let's shift gears a bit and look at the New England Puritans and their missions to the American Indians during the 17th and 18th centuries. This seems to have been a big inspiration for later Protestant missions.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there were some Dutch chaplains in the East Indies doing some evangelism,
Right.
but it was the Puritans working with the American Indians that really laid the groundwork for that huge wave of Protestant missions that came later. And their goal was pretty clear. Individual conversion, getting people saved, and then gathering those converts into churches.
Oh.
The ultimate goal was to make the Indian into, well, a Christian who also lived like an English Puritan.
So they believed in like a total transformation, not just religious, but also cultural.
Exactly. Civilizing is the word they used. And for them, those two things, becoming Christian and becoming more, English or European, they were like two sides of the same coin.
Okay, so how did they go about doing this? What were their methods?
Well, their first move was evangelism, mostly through preaching.
Okay.
Now, there were some, like Thomas Mayhew Jr., who took a slower, more relational approach.
Okay.
But most of them, they preached these really doctrinal sermons, fire and brimstone, repent or perish, that kind of thing.
Right.
Although guys like David Brainerd, they focused more on God's love and the personal experience of conversion. And they were really effective, too.
Okay, so once people converted, then what? What was the next step?
Setting up churches.
Yeah.
Building up a community.
Oh.
At first, they had this long probation period before they let new converts form their own congregations.
Right.
But over time, they sped that up. Converts got instruction and were disciplined, before and after the church was officially organized.
Yeah, okay.
The goal was to create these self-governing groups of true believers.
Okay, now the notes mention something called Christian towns or praying Indian towns.
Right.
What was the point of creating those separate communities?
Well, John Eliot, he was one of the big guys behind this.
Yeah.
He believed that new converts, they needed to be separate,
Okay.
protected from the bad influences of their old culture.
Yeah.
And even from some of the bad stuff in white society, too.
Right.
These Christian towns, they were supposed to be places where converts could really focus on their faith.
Right.
Live under the guidance of missionaries and, trusted Indian leaders. They wanted to promote, quote, a more decent and English way of living.
Right.
So for them, Christianity and living like an Englishman, it was all part of the same package.
So these towns were almost like these controlled environments designed for spiritual and cultural change.
Yeah, pretty much.
But it sounds like that approach, it may have had some unintended consequences. Did it make it harder to reach people outside those towns?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
While they were good for the people inside, they created this barrier between converts and their families, their communities.
Right.
Limited the natural spread of the faith.
Right.
Later, the Stockbridge mission, they took a different approach, a more integrated one.
Okay.
And it allowed for more organic evangelism, within those existing relationships.
So it's like a trade-off. You want to create a safe space, but you don't want to isolate converts completely.
Right, exactly.
So besides the towns and the preaching, what other strategies did the Puritans use? Education was a big part.
Huge part. They used both local languages and English. English was for, fitting into colonial society.
Yeah.
But the local languages were seen as the key to understanding Scripture, really getting the Christian message.
All right.
They produced materials in both. They taught reading, writing, math, Bible study, and practical stuff too, agriculture, domestic skills. And later, they even started boarding schools to really separate indigenous kids from their culture.
Wow. And they also invested a lot in creating religious literature. John Eliot, he was the pioneer there, right?
Yeah, he was amazing. His Indian Catechism, it was the first book ever published in an American Indian language. And then he went on to do the Massachusetts Bible, a complete translation of the Bible.
Oh, wow.
Plus, tons of other religious texts. So translating the Bible, making it accessible in the local language, that was central to their strategy.
And once again, we see that emphasis on local leadership, on raising up indigenous leaders to carry on the work.
Yeah, for them, that was essential. Both the missionaries and the folks back in England, they knew that in the long run, it had to be indigenous leaders who evangelized and pastored their own people.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, sadly, it seems these Christian Indian towns, they eventually declined. What happened there?
Well, a couple things. First, there was the constant pressure from white settlement, people encroaching on their land.
Right.
And then the pool of really dedicated effective indigenous pastors and teachers, it dried up for various reasons, and that weakened the communities.
That's a reminder of how even the best plans, can be undermined by those bigger social forces.
Yeah, for sure.
But it seems that despite that decline, the Puritans, they left a lasting legacy.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I'd say two big things.
Oh.
First, guys like John Eliot, David Brainerd, their lives, their dedication, it inspired a whole generation of missionaries.
Right.
And second, they created this blueprint, this basic strategy for Protestant missions that would go overseas. And it had all those key elements we talked about: preaching, church planting, education, translation, local leadership, the whole deal.
So the foundation for this global movement, it was laid right here in North America.
Yeah, pretty much.
Now, moving into the 18th century, we see the first truly international sending mission coming from Europe itself, the Danish Halling mission.
Right. So while English and Scottish missionary societies were supporting some work with, native folks in their colonies,
Right.
the Danish Halling mission was the first big effort from mainland Europe to send missionaries overseas.
Okay.
It started in 1705. The King of Denmark, he was a big supporter of pietism, this movement that emphasized, personal piety and living a devout life.
Okay.
So he recruited these German Lutheran missionaries from the University of Halle to go to Tranquebar, a Danish colony in India.
Okay.
And their leader, Bartholomew Ziegenbalg, he was a visionary. He had a strategy that was like way ahead of its time.
Okay, what made it so different, so innovative?
Well, first, he was all about holistic ministry. It wasn't just preaching, it was education. Translating the Bible into Tamil, producing tons of literature in Tamil.
Right.
He even pioneered using Tamil lyrics in worship.
Wow.
He understood that faith needs to be expressed in the local culture.
Right.
Plus, he did something that no one else was really doing at the time. He studied Hindu philosophy and religion.
Wow.
He knew that to really reach people, you got to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
Oh, and he did medical work too, taking care of people's physical needs.
He was a busy guy.
He was. It's a shame that some of the authorities back in Germany, they weren't always on board with his more progressive ideas.
It seems like a lot of these innovative thinkers, they kind of run up against the establishment.
It's a classic story. But yeah, Ziegenbalg, he was ahead of his time.
Yeah. And the notes mention another important figure in that mission,